I know about slashers. Well, I can tell you about the Freddys, and the Jasons, and the Michaels, and the Leprechauns. Slasher films have evolved over the years, from Psycho to Nightmare on Elm Street, to Scream, and then to Saw reboots. A slasher film is a subgenre of horror that is much gorier and has a simpler story, and is most known for the horror icons. A slasher film is a horror movie, but instead of monsters, it has violent, most of the time silent killers. The term slasher was first used as an informal term for any horror movie that involved murder, but it later became its own subgenre of horror. Slasher films were inspired by Italian giallo films, and some other movies such as Psycho, Peeping Tom, and some others. Slasher films are split into 5 different sections: Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Modern Age, and Postmodern Age. The genre has many tropes in it. One trope that is in many slashers in the 80s and 90s is that many characters die during or after sex, or when the characters split up. They also usually almost always follow the same basic formula. They all have the same characters except for the killers. The characters are usually a main cast of unlikable teenagers or college students. They usually fall into the same 5 categories: the stoner, the token character, the sexually active friend to the main protagonist, and the high school or college jock who is sometimes the main protagonist's boyfriend, and then the final girl. A final girl is basically the final survivor, who is usually female, but on very few occasions male, that confronts and kills the killer. The main cast usually change, except for the main protagonist, and the antagonist is usually a man, but on some occasions a woman, who is fueled by revenge about something that happened in their past that is somehow connected to the protagonist. The story of the movies also follow a very similar formula. They start with a starting kill that then transitions into the title screen, and then introduces the cast, then also introduces the killer, or if it's a sequel, it shows how the killer is brought back to life, and then the killer starts to pick off the cast one by one, and then finally, when only the protagonist is left, they then kill the killer, and then it ends with a cliffhanger or a jump scare. This simple formula is part of the downfall of slashers. You get tons and tons of sequels. Here's an example. Think of any slasher franchise and it probably has at least 7 sequels. Even if the franchise was bad to begin with or just okay, it still gets tons of sequels. Hellraiser and Leprechaun are both examples of this. All the sequels also follow the same repetitive formula as the previous one. Films became more well known for the killers and not the good storytelling. Not every slasher film was like this, but most of the more popular ones were. People watch slashers because of killers like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Chucky, Michael Myers, and Leatherface. The story of slashers in the early 90s became much more goofy, with movies like Nightmare on Elm Street and Jason X. At one point, people would get tired of the same old thing but with a slightly different cast, and this did happen in the late 80s and some of the early 90s. Movies began to sell less and less tickets. Not even giant slasher icons like Jason, Freddy, Michael Myers, and Leatherface were selling tickets anymore. This happened because of the repetitive storylines, unlikable cast, and many unnecessary sequels. It was like this until the early 90s, and in the mid-90s, the genre was revived. The 80s and early 90s were a dark time for slashers, with tons and tons of unnecessary sequels, and slashers trying too hard to be funnier to appeal to younger audiences. Slashers were pulled out of this darkness by Wes Craven with the movies Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and more importantly, responsible for the revival of slashers, Scream. Scream made a slasher that balanced comedy and horror better than the earlier movies that attempted to do this. The movie was much more meta than previous movies, and it made comments on the horror genre as a whole. They made jokes on the rules of how to survive in a slasher, like commenting on things like never go anywhere alone or have sex. The movie wasn't just funny, it was also scary with the opening scene. Because of Scream, the genre was revived and introduced to younger audiences. Candyman was the first movie to have the killer be an African American, and it was released in 1992. In the early 2000s, the LGBTQ community started making their own slashers to more represent others in the LGBTQ fanbase, with movies like Make-A-Wish and Hellbent. These movies were very different to other slashers directed towards straight males, without things like female nudity. African American filmmakers also began to make their own movies, with a more African American cast in the early 2000s, with movies like Holla Kill You and Somebody Help Me. few years, Hollywood has become a YouTuber and ran out of original ideas. So they thought, they just reboot the classic slashers, but we wanted anything new to make it better. The Friday reboot is an example of this, where it's just the original movie, but higher camera quality. Sometimes not even the special effects are better, like in the Nightmare on Elm Street reboot, where they try to pay homage to the original, but the CGI ended up looking worse than the original special effects. Sometimes when reboots do add something to the movie, it makes it worse, like when they made Freddy a child molester, instead of being a man who murders children, and the actor. Slashers have become less popular instead of transitioning to TV in recent years. Slashers don't have many famous directors, but some famous directors are Wes Craven and Rob Zombie. Special effects in slashers can be great, but also bad in the same movie, or just all bad in one movie. Talked about some slashers, but none of the ones that I've talked about today compared to the God tier movie that was the first movie to skip its own sequel. Thanks, kill 'em!